So looking at the overall use and the estimated use, the most likely course of action if CJ's was to be converted to essentially a mixed-use commercial would require 57 total spaces outside the central business zone. The proposed education institution, again, if located outside of the central business zone, would be 104. So by showing our math, the difference of the parking demand between scenario 3 and education institution shows that there would be a 47 space difference between the two uses. So again, the 47 spaces would be the estimated increase in mitigation in regards to the parking demand. So that's action item 2. Action item 3 is going over the approved criteria. Again, this is the approved criteria number 4 from the May minutes. And again, to reiterate, the number 4 for the approved criteria says the location, design, and size of the proposed use is adequately served by existing streets, public facilities, and services. And the board finds that the subject property is approximately 15,900 square feet and is located on the east side of North Main Street, just south of the North Public, where Main Street and Washington Street converge. Specific consideration has been given to traffic, parking, safety, and nuisance issues, as well as cumulative impacts of and proximity to existing commercial schools and educational institutions in the vicinity, and impact on availability of retail and office space, especially at the street level. Based on the assessment of potential impacts, the board finds that the applicant should be required to mitigate their disproportionate impact upon public parking in the vicinity by developing and providing 47 off-street parking spaces to be located within 1/2 mile of the subject property. The board finds that 50% of those spaces shall be provided prior to the issuance of the certificate of occupancy for the proposed educational institution, and the remainder within 5 years or when 150 full-time equivalent students are enrolled in the education programs offered upon the subject property, whichever comes first. And again, the reassessment of the approved criteria number 7. Number 7 stated that the proposed use would not be in conflict with the comprehensive plan, and the board finds that the proposed use is consistent with the comprehensive plan. With that, Mr. Chair, that's all the additional information that staff has to enter into the record at this time.
Can you go back a couple slides where you came to the total of 47? So the 104, I understand where we get the minus 57. The 104, is that what we're interpreting the load for that the type of use that the conditional use has previously approved?
So that was reflective upon the same process of the original CUP. However, the total number is the required based off of the available faculty and full-time equivalent. And that's a combination of both of those based off of the application. So that we look at the overall educational institution parking requirements as it applied to the original application, and that's where we came with the 104 total required stalls outside of Central Business District.
Okay. Can you go back another slide where you talked about scenario 1, the bar use? Is there, in the record there was concern that the bar use happens in the evening and we were asked to get information during the daytime. Would that number be indicative of restaurants and lounges if we took the bar aspect out? Say a breakfast club was there at 8 in the morning rather than a bar at 8 at night. Would that number stay the same?
The dance hall has a higher parking requirement, the 1 per 200 square foot. It's considered assembly space in building code. The restaurant, bars, and lounges, there's a certain stipulation. If it's going to be 4,000 square feet or greater, that would stay the same, but the overall parking spaces would reduce if you take the dance hall requirement out of it.
Okay. Because if the dance hall is out of it, if I'm not mistaken, we'd be dealing with fixed seating, correct? Okay. Any other questions for staff? Really? None?
I have a question relating to criteria 4, which was, we talked about one of the 2 milestones is when 150 full-time FTE students are enrolled in educational programs offered upon the subject property. And this is kind of, that's a little bit tricky to understand because it seems like the students will be dispersed among the various facilities currently in use by New St. Andrews, as well as in this building here. And so are you saying 150 FTEs who are going to be primarily using that building, or just the enrollment of the college as a whole is going to rise by 150 FTEs?
That would be in regards to the specific use of that property. So that RCS is tied directly to the direct use of that property.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
With that, we're closing the public portion of the hearing and opened up for deliberation amongst the board. Two things that we're going to do, not more strict, but a little bit more in line with how this should work. I'm going to ask for a motion after it seems like we're done deliberating. Before I ask for a second, I'm going to give us the opportunity to discuss the first motion. 'Cause I know that was kind of an issue at our last one. Marshall wanted to discuss something. We had a motion, we had a second, we needed to vote. So I want to make sure between a first and if we get a second that we have a chance to discuss it. The second thing that I want to make sure we do is, if there's a question that is asked, I would like it to be asked to me. And if it's something that the city staff can answer, that is the direction we would prefer to do, rather than put the appellant or the applicant on the spot to answer a question that might be deemed as additional information. So with that,
Clarification, Joe?
yes, sir.
If we have a question, you want us to ask the question to you, and then you would appropriate it to the correct person?
Yeah.
Don't want to...
Basically, before we ask the appellant or the applicant, we're going to ask the staff. So run it through me, and I'm going to turn right to them and say, can you clarify that for us before we have someone step up? So with that, who wants to go first? Marshall.
An observation. I really thank staff for the additional work that you did in compiling the information for the parking study. I know I was concerned with the original study that it didn't include the noon time, and so I really appreciate that additional information. My concern is that after our hearing and after the time allotted between our hearing and the council hearing the appeal and the study was done, that a large portion of the population of our city has left the country. That between the University of Idaho, which utilizes the parking spaces downtown, and the Moscow School District kids and faculty and staff that utilize the downtown parking, and faculty and staff like from Russell School. So there is some value in the new information, but I question the total value judging from the amount of people that are gone from our city at that time. And I realize that you could not adjust that other than waiting another year, and we don't want to do that. But to me, the new information was not as valuable as I wish it could have been. So the other concern I have is that with criteria, I think it was number 4, where it was stated that the additional parking needed to be located within a half a mile of the facility. And during our original hearing, I didn't realize how far a half a mile is. So I drove around this week and kind of judged distances as well as I could off my odometer, and a half a mile in reality is almost from the facility to Moscow Building Supply. And it's almost a half a mile from the facility to Tri-State. And so in reality, do we really expect that people will walk that far? And it's my personal opinion that no, they probably won't. So my question to staff, through you, Joe, would be, how did the half-mile figure come about?
Can you address that? Same with the parking the parking study done during non-school year? Because I know that was a question that I had raised.
If I might, that was an item that we clearly identified to the council, and the council is well aware that the counts would be happening at a time that the students were no longer in the community. That is also why we collected both 9 a.m. and 3 a.m., so you could look at the relative change in parking demand from the morning to the noon hour to the afternoon. What we saw, and whether it's reflective of when students are in town or not, was that the noon time to the PM didn't really change much. And so you could look at that relative demand change between AM to the noon, 12:30 to PM, and extrapolate based on the original counts. Based on what we observed, we would assume that the PM count was reflective of approximately the noontime utilization of available parking spaces downtown, because you really did not see much of a change. And you saw a actually fairly slight change in the overall parking utilization, or the number of spaces available, even between those two counts. The biggest change you saw was in the 8 a.m. count between the first count and the second. The noontime, which we didn't have in the first count, but the afternoon to afternoon was fairly consistent between the two. So we really didn't see a large change in the number of available parking spaces. I can't, certainly cannot state with, complete confidence that that number would not change when students are there, but that's the best available information that we could obtain. The half-mile distance was just an approximate. Generally, quarter mile is easily walkable. With a student population, generally they are able to walk a longer distance, and so the half mile was just intended to provide flexibility to find parking outside the central business district that could support the use. And so that was why staff did make that recommendation, and the board appeared to find that that was a suitable distance in their decision.
Okay. Thank you, Al.
I actually had a similar question along the half-mile line. If I'm not mistaken, even if that was a quarter mile, that would still get us outside the central business district zone. And one of the concerns was how parking in an unknown location would affect the central business district if that parking was in the central business district. So how do we address that? Because I don't know that we have a map that shows where that zone ends on the north end.
Correct. So this individual property is on the northerly boundary of the central business district. So certainly a quarter mile would get you some distance outside that. So a quarter mile is roughly 1,200 feet. That gets you about 2.5 blocks if you had 500 to 600 foot long blocks. The thought previously was 5 to 6 blocks was the half-mile walking distance, and that seemed to be for a student population could serve the need, and that was really the basis for that. If you had a parking area in the central business district, that is also likely to require a conditional use permit, and that will provide a second opportunity to review the impact of that parking use. Within the central business district, public parking is a permitted principal use, but it has to be open and available to the public. And if a parking lot was being proposed to be dedicated for an educational institution, that would require an additional conditional use permit for that parking lot. That is the exact condition that exists for the parking lot that NSA operates for their current downtown facility. There was a second conditional use permit that was heard, a public hearing that was conducted, and a CUP was issued for that parking lot to support NSA's use. If there was a parking lot that was intended to support this condition of approval in the central business district, there would be another public hearing to consider those impacts.
Okay.